One of the most ruthless and horrific war criminals of the Second World War was Josef Kramer, who was the commandant of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and he was also the brutal overseer of Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands, and he was a man who was condemned for his actions at the end of the conflict. But Josef Kramer was led into the execution chamber to face the infamous British executioner Albert Pierpoint, but following his execution, he was actually exhumed in the years after, and the body of Josef Kramer, along with many other terrible SS members and war criminals, was dug up and was moved elsewhere, and this action led to a huge amount of controversy. But this means that still today the remains and body of Josef Kramer exist on the earth, in a graveyard which not much attention is cast upon. Join us today as we look at digging up the executed beast of Belsen, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Josef Kramer, following a period of unemployment during the 1920s, became aware of the politics of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. He was someone who became attracted to the ideas being preached by the Nazis, and he went further as he joined the party officially on the 1st of December 1931. But he then also joined the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary death squads, who were the administrators, guards and executioners of the concentration camps. The SS became some of the most horrific war criminals of the conflict, and Kramer was one of these. He first served inside of a concentration camp when he was sent to Dachau, the first site that opened, in 1934, and he was then moved to other camps such as Sachsenhausen, then Mauthausen, where terrifying quarries were complete with the stairs of death. But Josef Kramer then became friends with some high-ranking members of the SS, and he was made an adjutant or assistant to Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Höss was the man who created the camp of Auschwitz, and he expanded the small site into a large and deadly concentration camp, and the deadliest of the Third Reich. Höss was responsible for the slaughter of over 1 million people, and Kramer, as an assistant, was very good friends with him. He gave Höss advice, and also he accompanied him on a number of inspections, before he was then given command of his own camp. This was Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp, which had been established inside the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which belonged to the French. But inside of the fences, Kramer got his hands dirty, and he got involved in executions and deaths. He ordered the gassings of 80 Jewish women and men, as their remains were then sent to a university to become part of a horrific exhibition. But Josef Kramer then admitted that the aim of the camp was to force prisoners to work in the quarries, and he did later say that he sent people to the gas chambers. However, Josef Kramer was promoted further, and he became a Hauptsturmführer, but he then was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau to oversee the exterminations of hundreds of thousands of people. Kramer was the commandant of Auschwitz II, Birkenau, the main extermination site, and he was in control of the camp's crematoriums. He was seen actively participating in the selections, in which new arrivals were sent to their deaths immediately after entering the camp, but Kramer later claimed that, "I never took part in the selections. I asked myself, is it really right about these persons who go to the gas chambers? I did not know what the purpose of the gas chamber was." But many witnesses later at his trial proved this wrong, and they noted that Kramer was seen regularly beating prisoners who were loaded onto trucks to be sent to their deaths immediately. He was also involved in the bloody aftermath of the Auschwitz Revolt of October 1944, and he carried out a number of executions. But Kramer inside of Birkenau was responsible for many other guards, who were brutal such as Irma Grazer, and he allowed his guard staff to have dogs, and these were encouraged to attack and maim prisoners, and there were many other inmates who were slaughtered willingly by his guards. Kramer was a man who was hell-bent on inflicting suffering, but then as the Second World War began to turn against the Germans, he was then sent on to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Inside of Belsen, conditions were truly horrific, and there were thousands of prisoners who were sent there to keep them out of the hands of the enemy. Belsen was a camp which was intended to hold less than 10,000 prisoners, and it became incredibly overpopulated, with dozens of thousands being sent there, and the strain on the camp led to a collapse of the infrastructure. There was little to no food given out, poor sanitation, if any, and there were also diseases which spread around the site, leading to thousands of deaths every single week. There were corpses all around the camp, and Josef Kramer was responsible for this, and he did nothing to help the situation inside of Belsen, and he also refused to abandon his post as a commandant of Belsen. Many of his guards fled as the Allies were advancing in attempts to save themselves from arrest, but Kramer remained, along with a number of other ardent Nazis, to maintain the camp's hierarchy. When the British and Canadian forces liberated the camp, they found a horrific sight of slaughter and depravity. They were disgusted by the state of the camp, but amongst the over 10,000 corpses found there were some prisoners incredibly emaciated who were clinging on to their lives. The British then ordered the seized SS guards to help clean up the dead. They were then interred inside of mass graves. However, Josef Kramer was arrested when the British entered the camp, and he was then brought to the Belsen trials, alongside other guards and staff at Belsen, and he was accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, not just at Belsen, but also at Auschwitz. The courtroom heard how ruthless and brutal he was, and he was seen battering prisoners and sending those to their deaths. But during the selection processes, he was also witnessed, as mentioned, driving people to their deaths, and he was said to have kicked one woman to death during this. He also killed prisoners from the Soviet Union, and was known for shooting those who were found eating mere scraps to just survive. But for his crimes of the Second World War and before, Josef Kramer was sentenced to death, and he was then sent to Hamelin prison to await his execution, which took place on the 13th of December 1945. In the days before, Kramer had met with the British executioner Albert Pierpoint, who had been summoned to carry out the executions, and Pierpoint took Kramer's weight and height to estimate the drop needed on the gallows to instantly snap his neck and kill him. Kramer was to be executed with 10 of his former guard staff. These executions began at 9:30 a.m. in the morning, and the condemned women, including Irma Grazer, were executed first, then Josef Kramer would be fetched. He was held in a small cell next to the execution chamber, and then Pierpoint, along with the prison guards, summoned him, and he was brought into the execution chamber. The executions were carried out in pairs, and at 12:15 p.m, alongside the evil doctor Fritz Klein, Josef Kramer was taken from his cell and was led towards the gallows. There were 2 nooses on this structure, and Kramer was then helped up the steps of the scaffold. His arms had been secured behind his back, but Pierpoint worked very quickly. At 12:19 p.m, Kramer went crashing through the trapdoor after a black cap had been placed over his head, and Kramer was the first of the men, alongside Klein, who were executed in the Belsen trial executions. Death was confirmed shortly after, and the body of Josef Kramer was then cut down, and it was then to be buried inside the prison courtyard. But this would not be the end of Josef Kramer's story. After being interred inside of the prison yard of Hamelin, alongside the other condemned war criminals, he was left for a number of years. However, the time then came when the British were to give control of Hamelin prison back to the Germans as they would leave, and because of this the graves of the condemned guards of the Belsen trials, including the grave of Josef Kramer, was disturbed. The coffins were dug up and were disinterred, and this included Kramer, Grazer, Volkenrath, and all the others whom Pierpoint executed that day. In 1950 the British handed Hamelin back to the Germans, and at this point there was a great concern about pro-Nazi groups in the country. Some people shockingly wanted to give those executed guards what was classed as a proper and decent burial, and a Nazi send-off, and it was in March 1954 when the bodies were exhumed and the ground was broken to dig these people up. The coffins were exhumed and specialists identified each of the remains, and their bones were then placed inside of new coffins and were prepared for reburial somewhere else. There were in total 91 bodies of the executed Nazi war criminals exhumed, and Kramer's was obviously one of them. The beast of Belsen's remains had been placed in a new coffin, meaning the old one had either been opened or it had decayed, and the remains were then taken to the nearby Hamelin am Veld cemetery. Kramer's body alongside the others was buried inside the cemetery that held the remains of ordinary civilians and former World War I soldiers, but where the bodies of the executed were interred, there were strict orders to begin with to prevent the site becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis. No memorials to begin with were allowed, but later crosses were permitted to mark the graves, but the neo-Nazis then began to gather around the burial sites. The people of Hamelin were not very happy with this, and one newspaper article of the time stated, "British occupation forces refused to interfere with German authorities who moved the bodies from a mass grave to individual plots in the city cemetery, after a campaign by neo-Nazi elements in Hamelin, Lower Saxony. 30 of the 90 bodies of the executed Nazi war criminals have already been moved from a common mass grave near Hamelin and reinterred in a city cemetery. The remaining bodies will be moved later. Amongst those reburied are Josef Kramer, named the Beast of Belsen, by inmates of the notorious death camp, and Irma Grazer, who hounded women prisoners at Belsen. Today the gravesite of Josef Kramer and the other executed former guards of Bergen-Belsen is allegedly just a small patch of grass by a path, which looks rather normal and discreet, and those who visit the graveyard probably do not know that they are walking by the remains of some of the most evil war criminals of the Second World War. Josef Kramer was a brutal and barbaric man who had little regard for the lives of the prisoners who were incarcerated inside of his various camps that he oversaw, and he did not seem to hold back in his actions in executing, torturing, and inflicting suffering onto others. He gained the nickname the Beast of Belsen for his work inside of the Third Reich's plans for destruction, but he was a man who was dug up and exhumed following his execution. There had been calls to get rid of the remains once and for all, as other nations would, following executions, cremate the condemned, then scatter the ashes. But still today the body of the Beast of Belsen lies on Earth. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.